Have you ever noticed how there are some people that you can practically read each other's minds? And there's very few points of tension in conversation because you both get each other. And then there are the others. And it's like trying to have a conversation with them very often leads to frustration or arguments, and you don't feel heard or understood, and or the other person, very often it's reciprocal. But for those of you who are very strong empaths and have exceptional emotional intelligence, then you might have to carry the burden of being misunderstood by people like this. And so it's not always reciprocal, depending on your psychological build. So let's unpack why that is, because this gets to what I call a cognitive error in reality creation. Because this is what I've observed in myself and also in others, clients and people creating their own reality and manifesting in the world, commenters that, receive my content. And so I have a couple of different viewing angles for which to make this assessment. And here it goes. Normally, a feature of humanity is that our brains are very adept at filling in the blanks. I talked about this in the last episode, and it's really important to touch on. The projection system is what we have running that transposes itself on top of reality based on what we expect. And this, when it goes haywire, particularly in abnormal psychology and other ways that it can happen, when it goes haywire, a person is not able to perceive objective reality. And so what ends up happening is that they interject their expectation on top of you, on top of your part of the conversation. Sometimes, and this is really freaky when it happens, I've had it happen to me several times actually, sometimes they will actually be so off that they build a visual representation of you that is nothing like you. And very often, and this is in extreme cases, so I want to be careful and not overstretch here, but very often people like that are quite disturbed. And if they have any predisposition towards anger problems, you can then become a symbol and a target for their viciousness because of this faulty perceptual image that they have constructed in their minds without even being aware of it, because this is an unconscious process. And if they haven't taken the time to understand their metacognition, their thinking about thinking, then they can just react and lash out at you and hold you responsible for all of the hurts and the crimes of people in the past. Now, normal humans, again, stepping away from the extreme now, normal humans do this too, but to a lesser degree. And you can see this play out in people who have a road rage. It's all of a sudden you're, like trying to drive and then you cut a little too close. You're not intentionally trying to upset anybody or to, push anybody off to the side or cause an accident. It's just one of those things that happens sometimes. And you're like, oh man, that was really close. And then they become this irate monster, right? And depending on how they handle that, they may escalate it and it might get really scary for you. Or they could calm themselves down, return back to their normal human operating system, shrug it off, put themselves in your perspective. This is theory of mind. This is the foundation of empathy. People who have personality disorders lack this, and also those with very, very heavy autism. And so as a result, they can't realize that you didn't mean to upset them. You didn't mean to do what you were doing. It was unintentional. And if they have a sort of victim wound, and they don't have to have a personality disorder or autism to have this feature, although I would say that there are those who are quite disturbed that would probably receive a diagnosis at a traditional psychiatric office. I'm just saying, like I've been up close and personal with people that have this tendency, and the closer you get to them, the worse they treat you, just FYI. Of course, from afar, they're very charming, they're very nice, they get along with a lot of people, but when you start to get really close to them, you start to realize what's a mask and what's the true person hiding inside, and you start to understand that their cognition is really, really faulty, and sometimes it's beyond repair. I don't even know if a traditional psychiatrist or a psychologist would be able to help people on the very far edges of the extreme, because they're just unhinged, and these thought processes go off, and they build, and it can just be a snap of a finger and you're looking at an entirely different person. For any of you who are living that, feel free to reach out to me for advice, but I'm very selective on the nightmare coaching. I've actually closed that down, and so I'm only taking clients on a very, very, very select basis, and the approval process for that is very stringent for good reasons. So, because there are safety issues. But if you're one of those, then let me know, and we can go through a consultation, and I can tell you if I can help you or give you some other advice. So what happens is that people will shortcut their symbolism, their history, their experience, their projection system. It's actually quite complicated, but I don't have time in this episode to go into all of the nuts and the bolts. But what happens is that everything becomes a shortcut and compressed into a knee-jerk reaction. And all of us have knee-jerk reactions. And it is the process of untangling those that differentiates those who are conscious and unconscious. I usually don't like to speak in binary dualistic terms, but in this situation, I'm choosing to, because it's important. There are people that do the work. There are people that go within, and there are people that don't even consider it, or find it too tiring. And I'm of the personal belief that there should be gatekeepers for people like that. And especially when they observe that they have a pattern of cyclical behavior that is violent or destructive. I'm glad there's a hell. Let's send them there. They can work out their issues with other people who have similar patterns. Just saying. So, back to the point. When we have knee-jerk reactions, those are an invitation to unpack the thought loops, really, or the chains. And what happens is that the sources of misunderstandings are very often an erroneous application of a person's symbolism, internal housing of all of the concepts. So let me back up a second. Every body has an internal working map of reality and concepts and symbols. We think in symbols and concepts, and then we make these connections, and we start to form ideas and beliefs and prejudices. And this is a way that we navigate our quote-unquote reality very efficiently. It's not a problem that our brain does this. It's a problem when we misapply our prejudices or our judgments or our shortcuts, or when they become outdated and we don't update them. I remember being with somebody, and this is part of being human, so this is not picking on them. But we were spending time together, and they were imprinting their past onto me. And I felt like they couldn't see me. And at some point in the conversation, it felt like they were talking to somebody that I symbolized in their past that I had never met. But I was having to, quote unquote, be held responsible for things I never said. For things I never said, or believed, or thought. And it was like this big moment where they were like, and you, da 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 da. And I was like, what? And it was like they were looking past me. And I felt as though they were talking to somebody else. Like they couldn't see me clearly. It was very strange. And that's when I really started understanding this principle of projections, because when I was first beginning my spiritual awakening journey, when my crown chakra opened and I began having visions, as we all do when we reach that stage, I kept having this vision of two people trying to talk to each other, but instead of talking to each other, they were vomiting out this black smoke. And they would go and they would try to kiss, and then all of this smoke would come out in their mouths. And it was like, my interpretation of it, again, we always have to be careful of the internal symbols that we have, right? Because the way that we code them is very predictive of where we're at in space and time. And when we start to transcend above space and time, some of these symbols become outdated, that we have to update them. And it's a process of evolution and change. We actually change our thinking structure. This is what transitioning from binary to quantum psychology is all about. Transcending the thought loops and the constraints of who we are when we were raised in a heavily linear society that was fixed to one timeline and one life. And you're either alive or you're dead. Definitely not both. Definitely not reality shifting into any other world. That doesn't exist. Of course not. So when we have visions, we need to understand that they are mapped to symbols inside of us. And those symbols need to be carefully considered and reviewed, because they can also be exploited depending on where you're at. But I don't have time to go into that. So the symbolism is how you construct your idea and belief about reality, and how you create reality and shift into reality. And when I was having these visions, I decoded that as though people were projecting and not seeing each other clearly. And it was creating this interference in communications and intimacy, which I happen to observe in real life. So I believe that I decoded that correctly, because I see this as a fundamental problem of humanity. Just saying. Another idea for transhumanism upgrades. You know, if we think of ourselves like technology then, and software updates, then I'm definitely putting that one on the list, because it causes more problems than I think is absolutely necessary, and creates so much noise in our social interactions, like the road rage people. But then again, you know, maybe everybody needs to be on the self-mastery journey, and maybe that's a delineating factor between who gets promoted and who doesn't, and who gets to pass through certain gates. I received a question about that recently. Does everybody get through the threshold? No. And rightfully so. Rightfully so, because when you've done the work and you've put in the time and the hours and the energy, you feel the difference. And then you see the difference in those that are not even willing. So we have, all of us, a tendency to fill in the blanks. And there is some degree of error in our communications. For example, I worked with a client who, rest their poor soul, were creating nightmares for themselves and were having difficulty seeing their contribution. This is common and very, very common. And they had very rigid thought loops, very, very rigid. And so, for example, they listened to an episode of mine where I mentioned that when you're shifting realities, sometimes you have to use your intuition and your body's intelligence to know if the food is safe to eat and which food is safe to eat. And I made a joke saying that in some places, factory food is where it's at. Sign me up. And that individual filled in canned food instead of factory food. And it's not a big deal, right? And I actually didn't address it in our coaching because we had more important things to talk about. But it's an example of this process right here, where we have a tendency to map our symbols with the language that we are receiving. We map our internal world onto the sensory inputs. And when we don't question it, like this person didn't question how they came to certain conclusions and were convinced that because they experienced it, it was all correct. This is a normal cognitive error. Very, very normal. But it's a problem, it's a hindrance. Because people don't understand the way that their brain actually works to create reality. And then they get confused. And then they get mad at everybody else, not understanding that their brain is actually creating misunderstandings. And so in their mind, they thought I was talking about canned food. No, I wasn't talking about canned food. And the difference is actually very important. I was talking about processed food, fast food. I was talking about heavily, heavily processed food. In some places, it's ideal to eat processed food because the nature has been poisoned. Lab meat, sign us up because the earth has been poisoned and nobody's talking about it. So you have to figure out if you're in a place like, sure, go ahead, drink the water out of the pipes. Yeah, I know, right? We're not going to go there at this moment. So I'm alluding to what happened in Ohio, just FYI. If you're not familiar with that, now's not the time. But they told everybody that the water was safe to drink, and everybody was questioning it. Like, are you sure? Are you sure? And it turns out it was not. So you have to be smart. You have to be wise, and you have to understand things beyond just what is the 3D representation of reality, especially if you sense that there is danger lurking. So that small example is not really relevant, but it's actually really important of the larger way that our brains will misconstrue information. Information is sensory input, and it goes through our filtering mechanisms, and it gets run through our internal databases. And when we mismap, what happens is that we construct meaning that's different from what the speaker actually intended. This is the source of misunderstandings. But have you ever noticed how there are some people that seem to have more misunderstandings than other people, like higher than average? It's because of this faulty cognition. And unfortunately, they're very difficult to work with because they very often feel victimized. But that's neither here nor there. So when you understand your internal housing unit, the way it is receiving information, how much fidelity is maintained between the speaker and the receiver, then what you do is you take the projection system and you almost link it with the other. And this is why those of you who have very high empathy very high emotional intelligence do this naturally. And this is why your skills and your gifts are not often seen or celebrated in society, because people don't know how much gymnastics you're actually doing to meet the other person. But I see you and I appreciate you. And we need more people like that. So please don't be afraid. But when working with difficult people, sometimes it's best to actually walk away from the misunderstanding. Because to repeatedly engage can actually, especially if there's any sort of self-concept wound, can actually lead to your harm, depending on how imbalanced they are and how willing they are to get lost and blinded in their own perceptual box. I've had to walk away from several people like that in my life after doing a deep dive into their abnormal psychology. And what I found is that sometimes they don't let you walk away. Isn't that interesting? And so you have to be careful when dealing with people that have very severe misgivings with the world. Because at first, when you're further away, you're not in the line of fire because they're looking and firing at other people. But the closer you get, the closer that target gets to you. It's a really profound disturbance that's unlike anything that I've really seen before. I think it needs its own DSM label, I'm just saying. It's really intriguing, super intriguing, and it's not necessarily all the traditional labels that we might think to use. But let's get back to the everyday example. Normally, people self-correct, and they learn through their experiences. They realize that there's a repetitive pattern in their lives and that they're the common denominator. And so then they start to look within. And so your key is to look within and to surround yourself with those who instinctively do this and who are able to take responsibility. And through that, it takes a little bit of time and a little bit of process and practice of processing your internal world to understand how you are mapping things. But when you do that, it is so liberating because all of a sudden you function in reality in the best possible ways. And it optimizes your reality in the best possible ways because you're no longer creating problems where there don't need to be problems. That is a hindrance to reality creation. And it doesn't matter. We can shift you wherever you want to shift to. But if you shift to that new earth and you start interjecting problems when there are none, or misunderstandings where there are none, or, God forbid, you don't take the time to understand that you're even doing that. Does everybody get through the threshold? I was asked and I was like, no. And for good reason. Good reason, right? So this is why there are tiers, interdimensional tiers. And this is why there is a self-mastery journey and criteria. And you are evaluated. We all are evaluated. And there are some people that don't make the cut. They don't. And that needs to be okay. It's not all love and light and rainbows and unicorns. Because there is a fundamental, I believe, cognitive flaw in humanity that until it's resolved, I don't know. That's my opinion.